Hello YouTube, this is Brench again. As promised, I'm here to talk about the game of Hnefatafl. And as you can see, I have my 11 by 11 board spread out in front of us with the pieces set up in the generally agreed upon configuration for the 11 by 11 board. And I'm going to be talking about some of the newer rule sets that have evolved and been created to allow effective gameplay for this very interesting but also very poorly historically attested Viking game. As I had mentioned last time, our historical knowledge of Hnefatafl's rules is pretty incomplete. For some of the games, like the 9x9 game board I showed you last time, tablet as it's known, there's a pretty well attested and extant account of the rules written down by Linnaeus that allows for a more or less playable game. However, the rules for that game seem to work very well on the 9x9 board, but it's not at all clear that those rules would work at all well for very much larger boards, which do exist, and smaller boards, which also exist. So with that in mind, there are a few more historical accounts of different versions of this game and their rules, and people have tried to use them to infer what it might actually be like to play a Hnefatafl game. For example, there's a much larger board for a game that was known as Alia Evangeli. The rules to that have been almost entirely lost, but what has been written about the game seems to indicate that, like the version of Hnefatafl I described last time, corner escape may have been an important part of the game. Likewise, for a very much smaller game, a 7x7 board, which was played in Celtic Ireland, Brandulf, that may also have been a corner escape game. And the reasons for this are somewhat different, but both relate to the size of the board. On a very large board, it can be hard for the black team to effectively encircle and blockade the edge of the board. So in a very large board, a corner escape game might make sense. In contrast, on a very small board, large movements by the king could very easily get him to the edge of the board very quickly, because there's not that many spaces to cover. So in that particular case, that corner escape can also make sense. One interesting caveat, though, is in the 9x9 board, we are pretty sure these days, after some initial mistranslations, of course, that the king's goal was to escape to the edge of the board. So obviously, different rule sets have evolved for different configurations of board. What we really don't know is the role or the rule sets that were applied for the 11 by 11 board. So there's been a lot of assumptions made as to how the game might be played. Some of them are historically quite quite wrong. For example, we know that in almost any extent version of Hnefatafl we have king capture as we play it, where you surround the king on 4 sides. That probably wasn't the case for any of the real games, except for the situation where the king remains on his throne as he is encircled by the enemy. So that is actually a modern innovation, and probably has contributed to some of the difficulty in playing an edge escape type game on the 11 by 11 board. But given that we have adopted this 4-side surround rule for the king for this particular board, there's been a lot of attempts to balance that out. And as I said, one of them is probably then making this 11 by 11 board a corner escape game. Because if the king has to be surrounded on 4 sides to be captured and not 2 like every other piece, he becomes a very, very powerful piece. And edge escape would be very easy for him. So reducing the size of the escape point for the king, reducing its fingerprint, so to speak, makes it much more likely, or rather makes it much less likely that the king will have an easy win, and brings some measure of balance to this very asymmetrical game. So with that in mind, lots of rule sets have been proposed over the years, and most of them are not too much more complex than the rules I outlined in the last video. They've been codified in different ways. There have been different instantiations of how the throne is used in captures, and perhaps how the corner fortresses, if you want to call them that, are used in captures. But for the most part, a lot of these rule sets are fairly similar. But obviously there has been some need for innovation because people have continued to try to reconstitute a playable game with this setup, configuration, and balance of pieces. One of the more recent attempts arose on the island of Fetlar in the Shetland Islands, which hosts an annual Hnefatafl competition. And obviously it was desirable to have a rule set that would be useful and balanced enough to utilize in tournament play. So for a long time, the Fetlar rules, or not for a long time, for more than a decade, the Fetlar rules were the dominant mode of play for the 11 by 11 Hnefatafl board game. In more recent years, people have noticed that the Fetlar rule set, which we don't really need to go into, it's basically what I've already described, is a little problematic in that it tends toward draws. In other words, black may have an ability to capture the king that is, perhaps, or at least prevent the king from escaping, I should say. Black may have a fairly easy time in preventing the king from escaping. So, setting up blockades across each corner that as I said, make it difficult or impossible for the king to ever escape. I don't know, something like this. But the king still has freedom to move around the board, as do all his pieces. Now, the black can begin to shrink his net in order to entrap the king, but it's conceivable, that white could make an arrangement of pawns around himself after some effort that allows him to continue moving back and forth inside a fortress, prevents black from ever actually capturing the king, even as it shrinks its cordon down around the edge of the existing white pieces. And this is a draw in Fetlar rules. That's unattractive because with relatively minimal effort, white can make it impossible for black to win. And that's not terribly appealing. So you can do a couple things here. I mean, you could call that a loss for white, really, because white has not achieved his goal, has not escaped to the corners. Or you could call it a loss for black, depending on your perspective, because black has not achieved his goal, which is surrounding and capturing the king. So in the early, or in the years after 2010, the website, I'm going to show that in the video, aagenieksen.dk, which is a great site where a lot of great Hnefatafl games and variants are played, embarked on a quest to try and lessen the drawishness of this game. And they came up with a few modifications to the rule set